Hi, this is a talk for the ICCV 2021 workshop on sensing, understanding, and synthesizing humans. In this talk, I'm going to cover two recent projects that I have been involved in that both target the challenging problem of generating animatable human avatars. This is joint work with collaborators from ETH Zurich, MPI for Intelligent Systems, and University of Tübingen. First, let's have a look at SNARF, Differentiable Forward Skinning for Animating Non-Rigid Neural Implicit Shapes, a paper that appeared at ICCV this year. Neural implicit representations are arguably useful for 3D human modeling because they are flexible in handling different topologies, and they are also resolution independent. They are continuous. The only factor that influences, in theory, the fidelity of the 3D reconstruction is the capacity of the neural network that represents the shape. The idea of neural implicit shapes is simple. We input a 3D point to a neural network, typically a multi-layer perceptron, and that outputs the probability of occupancy. It's a simple classifier that tries to classify if that point is inside or outside a shape. Once we have trained that model using standard classification loss functions, we can then at test time query that model and retrieve the surface of the reconstruction as the boundary, the decision boundary of the neural classifier. This modeling paradigm has become very successful for modeling 3D shapes, but mostly the shapes have been static so far. However, animating representations is not straightforward. And this is the goal of this project. The goal is to generate implicit shapes conditioned on a certain pose, indicated by P here as an additional condition to the neural network. And also, what we want to do is we want to learn these shape representations from deformed observations, from deformed raw shapes only. And this makes this very hard, because we are not assuming any intermediate supervisions, for example, on the skinning weights. The key question now is how to model and learn skeletal deformations of implicit shapes. There is some solutions for this problem already in the literature. A prominent one is NASA, presented at ICCV last year. NASA is a piecewise rigid model, which means that it models the shape as composed of individual parts where each part can be rigidly transformed. Consider these two parts here, which are passed through a rigid transformation to move from the canonical space to the post space. And then there is a composite operator that composites the two into a deformed shape. The problem with this is that at joint locations, this model is not very accurate, and this composition will result in discontinuities and artifacts close to joints. Another idea is to learn a linear backward scanning model, in short, backward LBS. So for each point that we want to query in deformed space, we have a skinning weight field that we use for a learned backward LBS model to move from the post space to the canonical space. The problem with this is that because we are now modeling a skinning weight field in the deformed space, this of course depends on the human body pose. We have a pose-dependent backward LBS model. And this is very difficult to model because if it depends on pose, and we have a novel unseen pose, generalization is of course very hard. So this model doesn't generalize very well to unseen poses because it needs to model this pose conditional skinning weight field. And it also cannot handle a one-to-many mapping where one point in the deformed space has maybe multiple correspondences. Consider, for example, when two body parts are touching nearly, then it's unclear if that point in deformed space should actually be associated with one or the other body part. So this model here has to commit to one solution, and therefore it will fail in such situations. In this work, we are proposing a solution to this problem, and the solution is simple. We are just modeling the forward skinning. We are having a forward linear blend skinning model where the skinning weights are now deformed in canonical space. Of course, this is not what we want. Because we have observations in post space, we cannot directly use this model to get the correspondences in the canonical space. But from a modeling perspective, it's much easier because now the skinning weights are not post-dependent anymore because they are defined in canonical space. The advantage of such a modeling paradigm is that if we can train this, we can then generalize to unseen poses very well, because the skinning weights are always correct. And we can also handle the one-to-many mapping, because if we can invert this function, then one point in deformed space could indeed be associated with multiple points in canonical space, because we are now looking at the inverse of this function. But how can we actually learn this? Well, as already mentioned, we need the inverse. And for inverting this forward LBS, we need to find correspondences. Given a particular point in post space, we need to find a correspondence in canonical space. Here you can see the example that I mentioned before. This is a point where two body parts are touching, and I could have a correspondence both at the torso as well as at the hand, here in green. So what we're going to do now? Well, we have here in this box a point in canonical space, and that point is passed through a neural network, a MLP, that produces a LBS weight field. And that LBS weight field is used inside this forward LBS. Here are the weights, and this is the bone transformation speed that are conditioned on the body pose. So they are used in this forward LBS to produce the point in post space. However, of course, we want to have the opposite. Given the point in post space, we want to know what is the point in the canonical space in order to learn the model, because our observations are in post space. But we want to update, of course, our geometry in canonical space. And we want to also update the unknown parameters here, the parameters of the weight skinning network. So what we're going to do is, given a query x prime, we're going to find its canonical correspondence by searching for it. And we do this by first noting that this canonical correspondence x star satisfies this expression where D is simply the forward skinning model here in blue. Of course, if we push that x star through the forward skinning model, then it should be equal to x prime, the point in post space. So now we can determine x star by a numerical iterative root finding procedure, by finding the roots of this function. And what you can already see is that there might be multiple roots. There might be multiple solutions. And this is why we can handle now a one-to-many mapping. How do we do this exactly? Well, we know that our human body is composed of, say, 24 human body parts. So we rigidly transform the query point with each bone as initialization. And then we run the root finding algorithm from each of these initializations. And from there, we collect only the valid solutions, which we define as the solutions that have converged, where if we take the solution and pass it through the forward skinning model, then we obtain back again the input point that we have queried. But note that this could be now this could be a set of multiple different points. This is why we have obtained a one-to-many mapping by inverting this operation, this forward operation, through iterative numerical root finding. Once we have now these multiple solutions, and these are the points now in canonical space, we can model the canonical shape as a standard single occupancy network. Now we are in canonical pose, so we can, in this canonical space, we can just query that occupancy network for the occupancy value. But we do this for all of the points that we have found. From all of the initializations for all the valid points that we have found, we need to query the occupancy network. So we get multiple hypotheses for the occupancy, and we can simply aggregate them using max pooling. So that's what we do here. We take the maximum of all of these, and that's finally the occupancy. That's how we define the occupancy for the query point x prime given the pose P. We train our model using a standard binary cross-entropy objective, but we found it useful to bootstrap training by, in the first epoch, adding 2 additional loss functions. The first loss function is a loss function that encourages all the points on the bone to lie inside of the shape. The bone, the skeleton, is an input to our model, so we can go along all the bones in the skeleton and expect our model that these points on the skeleton are inside the human shape. And this is already a good regularization to bootstrap training. Another thing that we can do in order to bootstrap the parameters of the skinning weight model, which we also optimize, we optimize both. We optimize the shape in canonical space and the skinning weight field in canonical space. So in order to help the skinning weight field, we are having an additional loss function at all the joints, where we say, well, at this joint, we want to have half the probability for the first bone and half the probability for the second bone in terms of the skinning weight field probabilities. How do we train the model? Well, we can use the standard trick that has been used in, for example, differentiable volumetric rendering before, which is implicit differentiation. I'm not going to go into details, but the idea is that we implicitly differentiate the level set constraint, and so we get a solution for the gradient of the location on the surface with respect to the parameters of the neural network. Let's have a look at some results. Let me play a video here. First, we see the training dataset that we have used, which is the DFOS dataset. These are samples from the training dataset. And here are reconstructions of novel poses within the training distribution. We are comparing backward skinning, NASA, to ours, and all with respect to the ground truth here on the right. As you can see, neither backward skinning nor NASA can represent the shape well, and it becomes even more severe in the case of OOD data, when we are reconstructing novel poses that are outside the poses that have been observed in the training distributions, where these baselines are really struggling with. Here are some examples for clothed 3D humans. The training data in this case is the CAPE dataset. Here we show reconstructions of novel poses outside the training distributions already. We can see the skinning weights that have been learned in canonical space here on the left, and the results of the post animation on the right. These are examples from SFU, and these are examples from CMU poses. And finally, we show some results on animals. Our method also works for animals. For animals, unfortunately, there's less data available. So here are some examples on animating animals using SNARF. In summary, Differentiable forward skinning allows for learning forward skinning and shape fields in pose-independent space. We can learn, in particular, we can learn from deformed shapes without direct supervision or prior knowledge, for example, in the form of the simple body model or direct supervision on the skinning weights. All of this emerges automatically from the model. The model allows for generalization to challenging unseen poses at test time because we are modeling the forward skinning process. However, root finding is time consuming, roughly 10 times slower than the occupancy query alone. And each iteration requires a skinning network query. Also, at the moment, we still require 3D data. For training our models, we've used watertight 3D meshes. So it would be nice to combine this in the future with a differentiable renderer to learn from images directly. Also, we require quite accurate poses for training. And so future work might integrate joint optimization for pose, shape, and skinning. Also, we have only considered a single subject so far. And of course, it would be nice to extend this model to a multi-subject approach. In the next part of the presentation, I'm going to present MetaAvatar, learning animatable clothed human models from few depth images, which is exactly addressing the problem of training with little data and in particular training without 3D data, without watertight 3D data. Still 3D data, but it's 2.5D data. So the goal in MetaAvatar is to generate controllable avatars learned from few monocular depth observations. Here are some examples on the top. You can see the 8 depth observations. Think of these as observations coming from a Kinect camera, a very cheap sensor that everybody has and that you can use to capture a human body very quickly. And on the right is the clothed avatar that we have generated in novel poses that can now be animated in novel poses. And here on the right is a different example. Our method doesn't require full body scans or per subject clothes type optimization, but through meta learning, we learn from the entire data set and can fine-tune the model, the pre-trained model, very efficiently. This results in fast optimization. For example, in these cases here, our model was fine-tuned on a new subject in only 2 minutes with only 8 depth maps as input. So the idea here is to meta-learn a post-conditioned hypernetwork to predict parameters of a neural SDF. And we're going to go through this now step by step. Our approach at a high level works as follows. Using a learned inverse linear blend skinning model, we transform the input depth frames into canonical pose first. So we canonicalize the input 2.5D depth maps to get these incomplete 3D point clouds, but in canonical space. We then fine-tune a meta-learned hypernetwork, which is illustrated here, to predict the parameters of a neural sign distance function in order to obtain a subject and clothes type specific dynamic SDF. And finally, given novel poses, indicated here by the bone transformation SPI, our approach allows for generating pose-dependent animated meshes. The simplest idea would be to just use meta-learning on a static SDF in this canonical space here. So what we could do is we could use, and this is also the layer that we are using, the network that we're using in MetaAvatar, we could use a 5-layer siren network with 256 neurons in each layer, as illustrated here, that maps from a 3D point in canonical space to the SDF value. And we can use a point-based on-surface and off-surface loss, similar to what has been presented in this paper, to learn directly from point clouds without having access to watertight meshes. This is the IGR paper. And then we can meta-learn the network parameters on all subjects using Reptile, which is a simple meta-learning algorithm. What it does is basically it tries to find an initialization of the parameters such that if we observe a new subject, we can fine-tune very quickly to that new subject. Basically, the parameters that we learn are somewhere in between all of the subjects in the training set. And so if we observe a new subject at test time, we can very efficiently fine-tune to that subject. That's the basic idea behind meta-learning. And the algorithm is brutally simple. It's basically just doing a few updates for each batch and then bringing the parameter closer to the average in expectation. Now, this model, this meta-learned SDF, allows for fast fine-tuning a new subject in the canonical space here. But it doesn't model pose-dependent deformations, which we want, and which is important to get realistic human avatars. So the next idea would be to meta-learn a pose-conditioned SDF. Same model as before, 5-layer siren network with 256 neurons in each layer, but now this model takes as input not only the 3D point, but also the bone transformations, the set of bone transformations which represent the pose and the shape of the subject. So we condition the network on the bone transformations B. However, what we observed is that this direct approach does not work very well. In particular, it leads to overly smooth results. Here's an example that compares this meta SDF approach, this direct meta SDF approach, to our results here, and you can see how much more details we obtain when we do our when we look at the results of our MetaAvatar approach compared to this rather naive conditional siren. So what's our approach? The idea is to meta-learn a pose-conditioned hypernetwork. As you can observe, there's not only this siren network here, but there's an additional network that produces the parameters for this siren network. And that's what's called a hypernetwork. We learn a hypernetwork on the parameters of the neural SDF. The hypernetwork is the network G with parameters psi. And then we let this hypernetwork predict residuals to the meta-learned SDF parameters phi star from this simple approach here in the beginning. And we found it crucial to predict the residuals and not to predict the parameters directly using this hypernetwork for bootstrapping learning. So we learn first a pose-independent meta initialization to this siren network, and then we have this hypernetwork here, G, that learns the residual to these parameters. And now we can fine-tune these hypernetworks that is also meta-learned. So these psi parameters of the hypernetwork are also meta-learned. We fine-tune them on the subject of interest at test time. Right? So we fine-tune psi on the subject of interest at test time. And at training time, we first meta-train these parameters here, these generic parameters, and then these residuals that are due to pose-dependent transformations. And we meta-learn the psi. At test time, then we fine-tune the parameters psi of the hypernetwork. This is all very simple. So here are some results when applying this model and learning from raw sensor inputs. On the left, you can see some rendered monocular depth frames from with simple estimated using the PTF approach. And we use this as input to our model to fine-tune our model. And what you can see here in the middle is the canonical pose space, where you can see the pose-dependent deformations. On the right, the final posed body. We can also use this model to fine-tune directly on raw, noisy Kinect data, as illustrated here. Here on the left, we can see raw, noisy Kinect data. Of course, the fidelity is not as good as the fidelity of such data sets, so we can't expect our model to be as good, but we still get something reasonable. The interesting thing about this model is that we can reduce the data at the fine-tuning stage quite dramatically and still get reasonable avatars, because our meta-learned hypernetwork has learned a good prior across all human shapes. Here's an example where we learn with reduced, or learn or fine-tune with reduced data. On the top left, you can see the usage of 100% of the data, 50%, 10%, and here only 8 to 20 frames, depending on the scene. As you can see, there is a loss, there is a drop in accuracy, but it's not dramatic. This is also illustrated here. So what we can see here is that if we reduce the data, despite not having a dramatic loss in accuracy, we can decrease the training time significantly. For example, if we just use like 20% of the original data, we have 2 orders of magnitude improvement with respect to NASA in terms of training time, because we just have to fine-tune the hypernetwork on the target subject, and we don't have to train from scratch, as for example NASA has to. Here's a comparison to baselines. On the top left, you can see the result from MetaAvatar, then on the top right from Scanimate, on the bottom left Leap, and on the bottom right NASA. In summary, MetaAvatar enables generation of controllable clothed human avatars. And I've shown that meta-learning allows for fast subject-specific fine-tuning from just few depth images. But hypernetworks are required to capture detailed pose-dependent deformations. Using these meta-learned hypernetworks, MetaAvatar enables realistic clothed avatars, the generation of realistic clothed avatars, in 2 minutes from just a few depth maps. But the learned inverse and forward LBS models and the bone transformations are required as input. That's all. Thanks.